Estradiol is amazing. Like I said in my book, I call it Queen Estrogen. The brain loves it. Mitochondria love it. Bones love it. It stimulates neurotransmitter. It feels quite good to have estradiol in the system.
Hi, and welcome to the Hotflash podcast. I'm your host, Ann Marie McQueen. I'm very excited about my guest today, Lara Briden. She's a women's health expert. She's been on the podcast now, I think, 4 times. And she reached out to me because she wanted to talk about estrogen. We're looking for some kind of middle ground here between the fear that arose out of the Women's Health Initiative and the overt estrogen enthusiasm. I like to call those people EMAXIs, owing to the crypto world. And so that's what we talked about, some of the things that Lara is seeing in her practice. And also all of the questions about estrogen that we have, like common sense. She has some really great things to say about testing, about the levels of estrogen, about how prescribing needs to be very nuanced. And it's really worth your while to take the time when you're looking at estrogen hormone therapy to go low and slow, to figure it out. And it's different through every stage of perimenopause. And of course, we talk about the power of progesterone. I hope you enjoy the episode as much as I did. Let's dig in.
I'm Ann Marie McQueen, journalist and proud 50-ish woman. And we are here looking for the true truth in perimenopause, menopause, midlife, and beyond.
Opening our minds to other possibilities is not always easy.
Hotflash Inc.
You're all woman to me. All right, Ann Marie.
Okay, estrogen. We're going to talk about it. I always say it like that because did you ever watch The Brady Bunch?
I did. Yeah, you and I are the same age. So yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. I didn't know if it got around the world. So, you know how everyone got sick of Marsha and they'd be like, Marsha. And I always think everyone's obsessed with estrogen. I always think estrogen.
Yeah. Yeah. We were in Canada at the same time. We were Canadian kids.
Yeah. Oh my
generation.
gosh. I forgot.
Yeah.
Why don't you not, obviously you're not speaking to me with that accent. We're Canadian sisters. Okay.
Yes, we're Canadian. Yeah. We would have been, same age. If we were in the same high school, we might have been friends. Never know.
Yeah. I think we probably would have been. Okay. So estrogen, you want to talk about estrogen. I want to let you run and just tell me what's on your mind. And I have questions.
Yeah. Well, I always loved estrogen, as an opening statement. In my books, I call it Queen Estrogen. I wrote a blog post back in 2011 saying in defense of estrogen, that was back at a time when that was about 10 years, I guess, after the Women's Health Initiative studies. People were very scared of the estrogen then and very fearful. And of course, a lot of younger women have problems from too high estrogen. So back in 2011, I'm like, okay, we need to defend this amazing hormone. It's my favorite hormone, estradiol, or ovarian estrogen. But it's powerful and it deserves respect, right? And it's definitely not, a little bit is great. So the more, the better. Like, you can't just max it out, turn it up to 11 and expect things to go well with this hormone. And so that's one of the things I wanted to say. I also do want to acknowledge 2 things as we're heading into this conversation. I'm, as I think I've mentioned to you before, I'm 3 or 4 years past my final period. So I've been on a lower dose estradiol patch for a while, and I'm currently quite happy with that decision. So I'm definitely not anti-estrogen therapy in any way, shape, or form. Even before that, I was advocating, even back in the 2010s, I was advocating for my patients to probably look at that, depending on what was going on with them, even in the final years of perimenopause. So and the other thing I want to acknowledge is true is that, yes, a lot of women have been denied it. So there were, a lot of women who probably could have benefited from an estradiol patch who were offered antidepressants instead or offered nothing. And so I share that frustration. I was there all along. I mean, I was practicing naturopathic medicine before the Women's Health Initiative. So my experience with it, the arc of my experience goes way back when, back in the 90s, when it was like, well, the pros and the cons. The pros is that estrogen therapy is good for heart disease, but the con is that, might cause breast cancer. And obviously the conversation has evolved since then. And I definitely, for everyone listening, like, I understand, I don't think properly dosed estradiol is a significant breast cancer risk. I don't think that. I'm on the same page with a lot of the current discussion. But at the same time, I'm having conversations with patients lately that make no sense. So I might just give a kind of a specific example. And I've been doing this a long time. And this is just something that's I'm seeing in the last couple of years. And this is not an isolated example. So without giving any, detail, obviously don't want to try to identify the person, but she's quite a characteristic example. So this would be someone in her early 40s who, has a lot going on, is been on and off an antidepressant, which is, coming off an antidepressant and then back on. And then she was on a bigger dose antidepressant, in which in her case, she's on something called Lexapro, which is known to cause night sweats. So when I had finally kind of been able to pin this down, I was like, I think your night sweats are from your medication. But she happens to be in her early 40s, and happens to be like on social media, and so happens to be seeing a lot about perimenopause. So now has this narrative, I'm in perimenopause, so I must need estrogen. Still having regular cycles, still having heavy regular cycles, and is now on. Next thing we know, tries some estrogen, doesn't help, goes up and up. She's now, next thing I know, she's on like 100 micrograms of estradiol patch, and progesterone
the highest
at
recommended
the wrong
dose.
time.
This is the highest recommended dose.
Yeah. And then plus taking progesterone at the completely wrong time, not even in her luteal phase, and her periods going all over the place, and she's feeling terrible. And I'm just like, how did we get to this position? Like, how are we? And plus, so this patient I'm thinking about has iron deficiency, confirmed iron deficiency, untreated, has lots of other stuff going on. And even in her case, she was telling me, well, I'm waking at 3 a.m. That's that's a perimenopause symptom. I'm looking back in her notes. It's like, well, actually 4 or 5 years ago in your late 30s, you were also waking at, 3 a.m. And I think it's actually a lot of from stress, and, you've had a lot going on. And obviously going higher and higher with the estradiol dose has not fixed anything in her case, has fixed nothing. And it's ended up, well, I mean, with doing harm in her case. I just, not that much harm, not to overstate it. I think it's fine. I think she can, bring the dose back down again and try to, address some of the other things, like the obvious things like iron deficiency. But how did we get to this point where, and I know I'm not the only practitioner finding this, it's just been in the last 18 months, women in their 40s with all kinds of stuff going on, thyroid and iron deficiency, but just whatever it is, they're now convinced that what I need is estrogen to fix this, whatever the problem is. And so obviously I'm quite upset about it. And, this is, from my long time with patients, I've never actually seen anything quite this crazy that's happening in the last year. And so,
can I just ask you two things? You said she's taking progesterone at the wrong time. So can you just explain that for her life stage? Yeah.
Well, I mean, this is an example. And this would be representative of a number of my patients. So this is someone who's still having cycles, still ovulating and has been told just take progesterone for the first 10 days of your cycle. I've heard that a few times. I don't know if the doctors mean the first 10 days of the calendar month, but the progesterone should ideally be it should be timed with the luteal phase. And I get that, later in perimenopause, as periods become very far and few between, that's a different situation. And there's different ways to dose progesterone. So there's not a one size fits all. But I honestly cannot understand why, if you're going to take 10 or 14 days of progesterone in a cycle and you've got an ovulatory cycle, I mean, why you wouldn't take it. And the problem is, if you start taking high dose estrogen and progesterone all at the wrong time, you're going to suppress ovulation. So then you're potentially going from someone who's still has an ovulatory cycle in their early 40s to now the bleeding is all over the place because of the hormones they're taking. I just, yes. So I've, reached out to you a few times. I'm just I'm very puzzled and
someone is
about
prescribing this for her. Someone is overseeing this care, though. That's the other end of it. So and I reached out to you about, I had a friend who got in a terrible situation, was also on 100 patch with progesterone at weird times and compounded progesterone peppered in, and it's completely mishmash mush. And I said, I don't think that doctor knows what he's doing. And he's very confidently doing it, but I don't want to, it's so nerve wracking when people are in this situation because you don't know whether you're coming or going. And I think you're buying into the estrogen. So you're going, you have to back up from it.
Yeah.
That takes a whole brain. What do you think?
I'll give you another example. I'll give you another example of kind of the craziness that's out there right now. And this was just more from social media, one particular comment I'm thinking of, but again, without, giving any details of who it was or anything, but here's someone who, for example, according to what she said, anyway, she's been dealing with endometriosis and adenomyosis. So she's been on actually the hormone blockers, like something called Zoladex, which is the GnRH, like they shut down ovarian function, like they shut down estradiol. And so she's been on that for a few months to try to get on top of the endometriosis. But at the same time, she's in her 40s. So she's hearing everything about how great estrogen is. So she's kind of saying, well, I think when I finish the Zoladex, I'm going to go on estrogen. I'm like, what? Why would you do that? Like you've literally just finished, like you've been on a treatment where you're suppressing estrogen intentionally. And that's another part. Another thing I want to say about this is, so, and this actually maybe is one of my most important takeaways in all of this, like, estradiol is amazing. Like I said in my book, I call it Queen Estrogen. It's the queen hormone. The brain loves it. Mitochondria love it. Bones love it. It stimulates neurotransmitter. It feels quite good to have estradiol in the system. And to be fair, every cell in the body makes estradiol. It's that crucial that every cell in men, women, and children makes estradiol. So we're never actually totally deficient of it, but that extra boost of ovarian estradiol that women make during our reproductive years is a superpower to a large extent. And so on the one hand, but we've just come through the last 50 to 70 years of hormonal birth control where the narrative has been that it is fine to switch off women's hormones with hormonal birth control. And just to be clear, like if you were to do for a woman on the pill, if you were to do a blood test of estradiol levels, she has menopausal levels, like very low levels. And in place of estradiol is another hormonal medication, ethinyl estradiol, which does not have the same benefits. And they know this. This is why, for example, women on the pill develop vaginal atrophy and some of the menopausal symptoms, and why women on the pill don't achieve peak bone density. That's partly because they don't have estradiol. It's partly the whole progesterone. Of course, progesterone is the other part of this conversation, but we've talked about progesterone before. So for the sake of today, on the one hand, we've got this very cavalier attitude towards young women. It's like, well, they don't really need their hormones. It's fine to like everyone to take hormonal birth control and only let the ovaries do their thing when you're ready to make a baby. Otherwise, just shut it all down. So on the one hand, that's supposedly fine for the 30 years of cycling, but then immediately somehow estradiol is optional when you're in your teens and 20s and 30s. Immediately you hit 40, you have to like take a maximum dose of it, or you're like, it's just, it makes no sense. Yeah. Like, how does estradiol go from being either optional or actually problematic because it, can drive worse and make periods heavier and all those things, goes from being optional or problematic to, you must take as much as possible. Like I know people are listening thinking not everyone's saying, take as much as possible. That's an exaggeration, but a lot of my patients and followers are hearing that. They are hearing, that they should take.
Oh, we see it though all the time. It's a very estrogen enthusiasm. It's a group of doctors that have gotten together and are promoting it on social media. And there has to be a push coming from somewhere. I'm reading, what I told you, I'm reading Ray Peat's book. Ray Peat, some people think he's a crackpot. I have the perimenopause game plan coming out. And I said, there has to be a middle ground between the maximalism seen in Estrogen Matters book, which was just republished, and what Ray Peat's saying in this book. There has to be a middle ground, right? But he does talk about the multi-billion-dollar estrogen industry. And when there is this much money to be made, you have to say, I need to be careful here. Because it feeds down from the top or from the bottom, or however drug companies work. It has to.
I think that's a factor. I think there's maybe two other factors that I have observed. So I think maybe there's maybe a financial motivation to some extent, not necessarily in the doctors themselves, but just like the whole apparatus, right? Like just, but I think two other factors that I see is, one is obviously trying to compensate for what happened after the WHI and women losing access, women who probably would have benefited from being on estrogen and not having it. And that's quite distressing and upsetting. And so it's a correction. And we have this thing, this sort of joke in our house, like usually in the car, or like if it's a very cold day and you want the car, my husband will turn the car thermostat to like 30, even though he only wants it to hit 24. But like he's like, I said, I don't think turning the thermostat up. He's like, no, that has something to aim for, right? Like it's like it's going to try harder to get all the way. Like, yeah, I don't think that's how it works. So it's like, so on the one hand, you obviously maybe some of these experts looking at think, okay, all these women, and I would agree, like many women out there who probably should have had some estrogen therapy haven't had it. Even now, there's women who don't have it, who probably would benefit from it or would have benefited from it. But overstating its benefits and kind of dialing it way up in an attempt to kind of compensate for that is not working, because it's actually harming women, because they're now got women over, as we've given like some examples, women taking mega doses of estrogen who don't need it. And because they're very confused. So that's one other factor in all of this. And the other thing, and this is just true for all of us, and all of us have done this. If something has really helped us, we become super enthusiastic about it. And estradiol is such a feel-good hormone. I can imagine, like for some people who've had, they went from like dark despair to I feel like bubbly and effervescent on this amazing hormone, you would become an evangelist for it. It'd be like, everyone has to have this feeling. Like, why would I, it's so helpful for me, I therefore must tell everybody about it. And I understand, I think effervescent is the right word for estrogen. Actually, it can be very buoyant. It does have that kind of, sort of sparkly, it's a sparkly hormone. It's very sparkly. And I understand that, but it just from my clinical experience and just the science too, like it's not always like that. Like it has a dark side too. It definitely has an overstimulating side, and some women do not feel good on mega doses of estrogen. I mean, that's just a reality. So, I mean, but I guess my point being, yes, I understand why people who have felt good on it would just be like, well, why would people not take it? What is possibly, holding them back? So
there's so many factors too. Like there's a level of groupthink about it, right? Where people I always say you have to look at the criticisms of something to fully understand it. And I think that there's a big groupthink, but because of this, the pendulum swung that way and now it's swinging this way. And doctors are really under fire for not listening to their female patients and not responding to them. And there's all that. But like, there's a lot of doctors getting into prescribing hormones that didn't, because, they didn't learn about it in medical school, and they're not prescribing them correctly. Like this is verging on malpractice to me, to prescribe like that. I don't know that they see hormones as powerful as they are. And it's these stories you hear, it's like, this is not proper medicine to just give more and more and more. Maybe it is. I don't know.
Well, especially with estrogen, because it's so powerful.
Yeah.
And as you know, I forget the technical term for it, but the symptoms of estrogen overdose can be quite similar to the symptoms of not having enough. So, I mean, it's pretty easy to overshoot the sweet spot and end up in the territory where you're just climbing and climbing with the dose and diminishing return, like worse than diminishing returns. Like you're just actually feeling worse and worse. So, I mean, the pendulum will swing again, because at some point there'd be enough women who did do the whole high dose estrogen thing and didn't like it. And, sometimes just come completely off it at that point, and understandably so. They might, if there's no one to kind of guide them down to a lower dose, they might just be like, oh, look, this is not working for me. Which is a shame. It's kind of a missed opportunity to, have it used a bit more cautiously, or,
Well, it seems like, first of all, I get those comments too, where it's just people talk about this magical experience. Like someone very eloquently said it was just like someone turned a little light on inside me. Or, my best friend who had slept after a year, and she slept I think the first night, like pretty well. But then someone wrote, it never ceases to amaze me how differently it affects women. It's fixed my best friend's life, and it sent me to the ER.
Right.
And that's how profound estrogen can be for, like, I mean, and this isn't the same. I don't even know whether I should tell this story because I took the NuvaRing, and this is not the same at all estrogen that you take. But I'm very nervous to take estrogen because it was supposed to be localized for birth control. And my whole entire body felt like it was on fire.
Yeah, NuvaRing's not localized. It never should have been promoted to you as localized because it's known to be a delivery system for the entire body.
Should I not even say that, Lara? It's not even a good example, but it's something that makes me nervous about estrogen, because that experience.
Yeah.
And also my doctor told me it was impossible that I felt that way.
Yeah.
But I'm one of those women who haven't been given estrogen because I first I had a doctor who was like, I don't like what we have here in the UAE. And then it's very hard to find a doctor you like here. It's getting a little bit easier, but if you find one, they leave. So I found one from India I really liked, and she's just delivers babies all the time. And so we've had so many conversations about hormone therapy. And I thought once I got through menopause, I felt like we were getting to a place where she was going to give it to me, and she won't. And she just doesn't feel comfortable. And like we had like an hour. I had brought your book, and I was showing her my form, and I should get another gyno, but I don't know now. I'm feeling pretty good. She would be ripped apart on social media by some of these people who are, angry about this.
Don't give her name.
I have a lot of respect for her. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I have a lot of respect for her that she doesn't feel comfortable. She doesn't know. She really respects it.
Right.
She's very, and I know there's, that tone of like, this is so wrong to be this way. She's a very extreme example, but I believe there should be a great amount of respect for it. And I'm scared. I don't see that. And you're telling the stories and I'm hearing the stories.
When I was a newspaper editor, I banned all headlines that said, "New Year, New You." We do not need to be any different, in my opinion. Now, renewing ourselves, that's something I can get behind. One way to go about this is Mitopure by Timeline. Mitopure contains the rare postbiotic urothalin A. It works by promoting a process of cellular cleanup that clears out dysfunctional mitochondria. And mitochondria are what power your cells, which are what power you. Mitopure's own testing has shown improvements in energy levels, recovery time, endurance, and more. Timeline is offering 33% off your order of Mitopure while supplies last. Go to timeline.com/hotflash33. That's timeline.com/hotflash33.
Yeah, I don't think women need to be scared of it. I think, I actually do think probably the doctor you're describing is, I would think maybe she's being that's too cautious. I think it can be used quite safely.
It is too cautious. I mean, I'm sitting there telling her, well, I gotta get out of
but also, another thing about it, actually, especially I guess, and obviously we're talking about we're always comparing apples with oranges. So it sort of depends on which stage a woman is in, right? So it's not even as simple as perimenopause versus postmenopause. It's not even that simple because there's the different phases of perimenopause. And so early in perimenopause, this is the other thing I wanted to talk to you about today, is estrogen is higher than normal. This is just a fact. And so a couple things about that. So estradiol is normally going up and down every cycle. People know that. When it goes down, what I call the trough, or not just me, but it's called the trough, the ovarian estradiol reaches its lowest point during the period. So just before the flow and during the flow and before it starts to climb again. And it bottoms out to menopausal levels. That's normal. Young women, in fact, older women, perimenopausal women actually their trough doesn't go as low. So young women would actually hit a lower estradiol on their, early days of their cycle than older women do. So, but the big difference with women during the perimenopause transition is estradiol starts climbing way higher, like up to 3 times spiking up. And then that does create quite a steep downward, even though the trough isn't as low, it's a screeching ride down over a few days. And that there's no question, there's very little question in the science that women feel that. That's part of what's creating some of the anxiety and night sweats. And of course, Professor Pryor, who has been on your podcast multiple times, would argue, actually, that's where progesterone can come in and kind of shelter from that, steep downward estrogen. But you can also arguably, I think if anyone in the early phases of perimenopause was going to use estradiol at all, it would actually make sense to use it during that trough, right? Like during the time to shelter from so it's not as steep a downward journey, but you shouldn't have to ever take it throughout the whole cycle, because especially in the early phases of perimenopause, when estradiol it's going so high. At that point, the ovarian production of estradiol is dwarfing, like any amount from the patch is like minuscule at that point compared to how much the ovaries are pumping out. And actually, what I find for a lot of patients who maybe have, been with me or then gone away and come back, it's like, oh, I got started on HRT. Everyone just says HRT, but usually they mean estradiol patch plus oral micronized progesterone. In New Zealand, it's Utrogestin. And they'll say, yeah, the first night I took it, I slept amazing. I'm like, right. Was it the estradiol patch or was it the progesterone? Because if anyone who's taken progesterone alone will know, the thing about natural progesterone or oral micronized progesterone is it knocks you out like normally. Some women get a different reaction, but normally most people are like, wow, that's the biggest, like the deepest sleep I've had since I was a teenager. That's usually the progesterone. So I think when women, especially earlier in perimenopause, when they're describing how amazing they feel from HRT, a lot of the time it's progesterone is doing the work and estrogen's getting the credit. So that's another sort of just clarification that can help people troubleshoot what's going on for them.
Progesterone's doing the work and estrogen's getting the credit. Well, this is why, you have, for cannabis, they say go low and slow if you're going to experiment. Why can't you go low and slow with this? This is like, what you hear is go high and stay high, like go in with guns blazing. What is wrong with starting with progesterone in those early stages? But that is one of the gaps, because you're saying that, other practitioners who are integrative and functional are saying that, but over in the mainstream, you'll get estrogen. You'll walk out of there with an estrogen patch.
Because of your brilliant writing, I still love your article about the weird vibe around progesterone. It's true, because progesterone just decades ago, got tarnished with being kind of a naturopathic alternative thing. It is now mainstream, but it's still not really yet recognized for who it is, the benefits that it can bring beyond just protecting the uterine lining. Like it promotes sleep. I mean, that hands down, the research is very clear on that. Estrogen, I think, can also help promote sleep sort of later in the perimenopause transition. I do think that actually can help with circadian rhythm. But if there's a hormone that is sedating or like actually sleep promoting, especially in the early phases of perimenopause, it's progesterone. And as you know, in my book, I do talk about in those early phases, it probably makes sense along the lines of your, starting low and going slow, like start with progesterone alone just for a few nights so you can see how that feels. Just, if nothing else, just as a scientific, like, I just want to see how this part of the medication feels. And then I'll bring in a little bit, and then at some point, maybe bring in a bit of estrogen and feel how that, and see how that feels. Also, through all that, you do have to also consider where you are in your own cycle and kind of what's happening with your own hormones when you're bringing the other hormones in, which I know it takes a bit of troubleshooting, but it is worth thinking about that, like putting in the context of is my estrogen high or low, where you are in the cycle. And another thing, people talk about testing, trying to test estrogen. One thing I'll just say, a takeaway for everyone listening: if the period is heavy, estrogen has been high. You don't have a heavy flow if you didn't have a lot of estrogen around to build up that uterine lining. So I also saw someone on social media very confused about that, saying, oh, is heavy bleeding a symptom of low estrogen? No, in no universe is heavy bleeding a symptom of, chronically low estrogen. It's
it's high estrogen. And, I guess the thought is that it gets lower and lower, but it can still surge in the later parts, can't it? Estrogen?
Totally. So I think, what happens is, I think just what happens for most people is, there's always going to be points in the cycle, even in women's reproductive years, when estradiol goes very low. And that's during the period. And that's what premenstrual syndrome is to a large extent. There's different causes, but like that steep decline of estradiol at the end of the cycle, most women will feel that in their mood to some extent. And then and progesterone will help to sort of buffer that. And then as perimenopause begins, the early phases, which I would say is defined by the loss of progesterone, shorter luteal phases, less progesterone around to kind of buffer everything. Also, estrogen starts spiking up high, as Geraldine Pryor calls it, the ovaries grand finale. It's like a fireworks display. It's like the ovaries just start. It's like, right, okay, let's just make way more estrogen than we ever did before. But they're making it, there's spikes. And so there are very steep declines. And there are going to be some times of going down, riding the estrogen roller coaster down really hard and fast. And that is going to potentially trigger anxiety and depression, potentially symptoms, and night sweats for sure. And that's, I mean, how do you define that? Is that a high or a low estrogen state? I mean, it's still technically a high estrogen state, but with some moments of strong estrogen withdrawal. And
Yeah.
it is withdrawal. It's legitimately withdrawal because estradiol is that powerful in the brain that the brain gets a withdrawal from it. It's like a drug.
Yeah, I think
So,
I
yes.
feel like
Yeah.
the last years of before menopause, I was angry. I was dating like a mad woman. I was driving up to Dubai and dating. I was really interested in it. And I had the libido going like in a crazy way.
Yeah.
But then also I would have these moments of like deep despair. And I think like, I just feel like looking back once I'm out of it, that it was still, and I don't know whether estrogen would have evened that out at that point if I could have gotten it.
It could, like I said, it can even out the troughs of despair, like the estrogen withdrawal and the estrogen crashing down.
Oh, I had sore breasts too, terribly sore breasts.
So breast pain, especially that kind of breast pain where Geraldine Pryor talks about, like when you push in from the front, if that evokes pain, that's high. That's a sign of high estrogen. So breast pain, very like heavy periods, those are all signs that estrogen has been high, although it may have gone through a like acute withdrawal phase. But then but later in the perimenopause transition, when you might not have a period for 4 months or something, or 5 months, those are going to be some times of like a plane of, after the peaks of estrogen going up and down, you're now in the plains or the prairies of like, okay, the estrogen's pretty low, much lower than used to. And I think that's a time when estrogen therapy could be helpful. And that's why we see in the research, estrogen therapy being helpful for mood during the perimenopause transition. They're usually talking about either in the troughs or in those later stages of perimenopause when there's big gaps between periods. And I think you can get more. I actually find as a clinician, I get more just from asking people what their periods are doing and when their periods are coming and how heavy they've been and when the symptoms are in their cycle versus testing. I'm not anti-testing, but I do feel like depending on when the test is timed, you can always pick up a low estrogen. Keep in mind, young women with perfect hormones will have menopausal levels of estradiol from days like, 1 to 4 of their cycles. So depending on when you test, you're going to find either high or low estrogen. So,
okay. So this testing issue is very interesting to me. A company reached out to me and said, you want to do our test? And it was a Dutch-like test. And then I spoke to their naturopathic doctor. And I've done a lot of this in the last couple of years because a lot of these companies are coming up, and I was running a health and wellness website here. And you can get very confused. Like, I'm a journalist, and when I'm talking about my own health, I decided I have to stop taking these because you can get this, like, all these different voices coming at you, and you're this or you're that. But I remember, like, I had been through menopause, and she said your estrogen is very low, and then I was like, oh, and so I have a friend who said she's gone on her estrogen. She's gone on her hormone therapy with estrogen, and she's waiting to have her levels tested. And I just find the whole thing interesting because we're postmenopausal women.
Yeah. Very good
Our
question.
estrogen levels are going to be
They're
low.
supposed to be low. Yeah. So there's a few different parts there to what you've said. So, I mean, I guess there could be a place. I could see maybe why clinicians, if they've prescribed estrogen and they want to just see, what levels it's reaching. And also the other thing with some of that, the urine testing would be you can also look at how the estrogen is metabolizing and leaving the body and
want to talk
what
about that.
metabolites it's forming.
That.
And I think that's valid. Actually, I don't actually do a lot of that testing myself, but I think that's valid. So again, I'm not anti testing, but in terms of also just the statement that your estradiol is low, it's like, well, of course, like it's low because that without testing, right? Like if you're postmenopause, your estradiol is going to be low. Just as in a young woman, if you test on day 2, her estradiol is going to be super low. Like by definition, that's how the body works. In terms of what should it be, and I find a lot of my followers are very confused about this. I think because of all the messaging they're getting, there's somehow, I mean, it's not, they're like, well, what levels should you have post-menopause? It's like, well, that's the $1 million question. I mean, you should have, like, we're evolved to have low levels then, but we could talk more a bit about evolution of menopause and what that means. But the other part of the story is how well is the body responding to that? So as I talk about in my book, Hormone Repair Manual, it's a recalibration. So it's not just what your levels in your serum are, it's like how many receptors you have on all the cells, including your brain cells. How much estradiol are the cells making themselves? Because even the brain cells make their own estradiol. And how receptive are the receptors? And we do know that all of that other part of the story. So it's not just how much estrogen is floating around. It's like, what is the body doing with that? And yeah, I mean, there's some early signs in the research that, yeah, after menopause, all the estrogen receptors in the brain kind of shuffle around and you get sort of more of them and different sensitivity. And that totally makes sense because the body's trying to, it knows there's less estrogen around. So it's changing how it does things. And that's part of the recalibration. So I don't think, yeah, there's no one level that it's supposed to be, certainly post-menopause. No.
There's also like a little bit of research that perhaps some of the estrogen we make doesn't show up in the blood at postmenopause.
Oh, most of it. Yeah, it's inside the cells. The cells are making their own. They're making, in theory, they're making the amount of estradiol they need for their own sort of processes. And also,
this
I mean, the
whole
body is also
idea,
making. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but that whole idea of testing your blood, it's not reflecting all the estrogen that's in your body. So it's a bit of a.
Yeah. And it's also not reflecting what your receptor status is and what your body, your cells are doing with the amount of estrogen that's around. And to be fair, the ovaries are still making some estradiol. So we're still making estradiol from the ovaries and, from other adipose tissue. And so, I mean, it's actually still a fair amount of estrogen floating around. Yeah.
So there's
not one magic number that is supposed to be.
Right. It's just, it's a very simplified way of looking at it. And then, I asked ChatGPT the other day how many processes are happening in my body right now, and it couldn't come up with a number because I think, I don't think anyone knows what the number is. I hear it's always countless or, I just think, and it made this huge list of everything that's going on right now. And my mind was boggled. But also there's a doctor on social media, is very popular. And I saw her holding up like a parking space in a car. And like, this is the estrogen receptor. And this is the estrogen, but you throw that away. And like, this is just sitting here empty. There's nothing, this sad receptor has nothing to park in it. It's just all empty through your whole body. I just find this so damaging. But when you hear that, what do you think? Is it true?
Well, again, I mean, the body's not static. So the body is like, right, okay, there's less estradiol around. So in theory, the body would be like, okay, right. So we need to, have a different number of receptors to make the most of the estradiol that is around, different sensitivity of the receptors. And I will acknowledge, just as I'm saying this theoretical recalibration, which I think we know does happen because we know, like, from across the world, that women across all cultures go into menopause or through menopause, however you want to describe it, and mostly don't report any symptoms at all and are generally happy about it. We do know that from all the anthropological research, which is we can't ignore that. I mean, that is something. So, yeah. So, I mean, in theory, we can recalibrate. The body can be happy with a lower level. The receptors can adjust to a lower level of estradiol. I do think in my book, I talk about how I think that's not always happening in our modern society for different reasons. I think that natural recalibration is impaired by lots of different and things that are not women's fault, not just lifestyle, but also just environmental toxins would be a really good example. Being exposed to those for a few generations has potentially made this what should be a symptomless transition more difficult. And that's certainly there's a case to be made there that given how difficult it is, and yes, women potentially do need estrogen therapy at that point. Especially, I mean, also in my book, I talk about the tipping point. I think if the body can't, for whatever combination of reasons, is not adapting well to that new lower estradiol, that we do know that, I mean, that can set women on the risk, like a longer term risk to cognitive problems or cardiovasculars. So, I mean, I think it's nuanced, right? Like, it doesn't mean just because in theory we should be able to recalibrate and adjust to lower estrogen doesn't mean that everyone always is. And actually, this is something I do want to mention. I just saw this in a paper the other day. I'll have to, if you want to, for the show notes, I can probably find the citation, but it was very reassuring. This is like an important detail. The brain fog or reduced cognition that a lot of women experience with perimenopause is not, what was the word they used? It does not, I've lost the verb that they use, but it does not automatically mean dementia, right? Like, it's not like women, it's like, that's not an early sign of dementia, which is
That's
not
not
to say
early
that,
sign. We think it is, but it's not an early sign
no,
of it. Yeah.
right. I mean, we think it is, so it's very scary. It's not synonymous with dementia. I mean, at the same time though, there is, I mean, I think women who do go down the path, unfortunately, to dementia, maybe some of that could have started with the impaired calibration or some problems at menopause, but just this very common symptom of having brain fog does
Mhm.
not automatically mean menopause. So I think that's important for women to understand. And I think, and in terms of what hormones can do for that brain fog, I think it's actually hit and miss. I think sometimes they can relieve it, and certainly there's people listening probably who estrogen did relieve it, and actually did in my case. I think sort of helped to some extent with that, but it doesn't mean it
That's
doesn't
why
always.
you went on it, right? Was brain
Yeah,
fog?
to some extent, yeah, the brain fog, and also there's another aspect to that brain fog component, which I do talk about a little bit in my book and a lot of my practitioner training seminars. I'll talk about it. I talk about it, but I'll share it here because it's just an important detail. And there's, again, I can give you the paper for your show notes if you want, but it's one of the things that estrogen does is it helps the body to produce choline, a nutrient called choline, which is the precursor for acetylcholine. The brain loves acetylcholine. It's a very important neurotransmitter. And so we're supposed to get it from diet, and then we can make a little bit of it ourselves. So, and that enzyme that helps make choline is upregulated by estradiol. So for people who maybe have, and I personally, that's the reason I thought to share it is because I do know that I have the double SNP, as they call it, or the variant of the gene. I'm a slow choline producer. So probably my ancestors would have been eating a lot more choline. We're not very good at making it. And so for women who, because our modern diet's quite low in choline, and then this, like, the on top of that, going through menopause and then having estradiol go down, acetylcholine will drop even more. So this paper was kind of making the point, like, they like even asked the question, like, oh my goodness, is one of the main mechanisms that estrogen improves cognition just the fact that it boosts choline? And could you also just take choline? Like, or could you also just like eat more or supplement it? Like, which is kind of an interesting question, especially for women who, there's women who are out there who, for whatever reason, can't or don't want to, or can't take estrogen. I mean, it's good for them to know there's other ways for their brain.
It's also good for them to know, this is my viral video on TikTok in February, where it's good for them to know that there are drugs that are anticholinergic, which I cannot.
I know. I remember.
I mispronounced it.
Yeah.
Hey, it's true. If you mispronounce something, TikTok likes it. There's people
they
who
love it. Oh, that's
yeah.
good
And
to know.
like,
actually,
no, it makes the video popular because people are like, she's not pronouncing it right. But it was just about how this is hitting the mainstream, where you could find it if you just did a Google about these different drugs that we were all given when we were kids, and that many people take to sleep every single night. If you are a woman in your 40s and you're experiencing all this, and you're taking one of those different drugs, then you're just adding insult to injury. Did you know I also have a Substack? That's just a fancy way of saying I have a newsletter. But listen, it's not like every other newsletter. I am the only journalist in the world who's made menopause my beat. And each week I share research, news, products, tips, and tricks from the world of menopause and midlife. Sometimes I even write an essay. Hotflash Inc. on Substack is where I pull together everything that's here and in the menosphere, and I break it down just for you, so that we can try and make sense of it all and figure out what to do together in real time. Join more than 5,000 women practitioners, CEOs, and more, and become a subscriber today. You can get my podcast as well as special video and audio drops you can't get anywhere else. Sign up today at hotflashinc.substack.
Yeah, the dementia risk long term. I mean, I think short term it's okay to take antihistamines, and like some of the antidepressants
Some of them are fine. There's the new
anticholinergic
classes that are fine. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But yeah, long term, it, I think, quadruples the risk of dementia or something like that. Not very often you get scientists get to say something quadruples. That's a big effect. So that's that whole system, acetylcholine, making sure adequate choline intake could help with some of that as well. So, yeah.
Okay, and I really want to talk about estrogen metabolism, because I haven't talked about this very much because I don't fully understand it. But why is it important? how we metabolize our estrogen? How can we find out how we metabolize our estrogen and improve how we metabolize it?
Well, one of the first things, even before you get into any sort of fancy, what's happening in the liver and which pathway is it going down, the main way estrogen leaves the body is through the stool, through the bowel. So regular bowel motions and healthy gut is a really good way to ensure that estrogen's always on its way out. Otherwise, if there's problems in the gut, then it can potentially be kind of the estrogen metabolites that are supposed to be on their way out will get take it up again. So reuptake of estrogen.
Can I ask you a personal question? So fibroids, if you had IBS and you had fibroids, there's a connection there, would you say? Like, to me, I was just like, why is everyone growing fibroids? Why am I growing a fibroid? And I did have IBS. So if you're having for years, you're not having proper movements.
In theory, I'll be honest though, fibroids are my big, one of my taglines is women's health is not as mysterious or complicated as we've been led to believe. I mean, I do think a lot of things are pretty logical, but fibroids are a little bit more mysterious. My understanding now, finally, after talking to various people about it kind of makes sense. There's different types of fibroids, as in different things are driving fibroids in different women.
Not just one type of
yes.
one. Yeah.
Well, I mean, estrogen is driving fibroids, but sometimes progesterone drives them, which is actually a little bit awkward. And, I think various nutrient deficiencies might play a role. So yes, maybe you'll have to find out. We'll see if we can find a fibroid expert who can, because maybe I'm not.
That is a really good idea. Okay. Also, I won't ask you a question, but
it's a good, I mean, yes, in general, if there's gut problems, there could be a problem with estrogen recirculating and increasing.
You need to be pooping.
That's called
you need to have good poops. Sorry.
This is called the estrobolome. It's called the estrobolome. Sure. So I think I've got the word right. Maybe I've mispronounced it, which will help this go viral. But like, this so it's.
Or is it estrobolome?
Estrobolome. Yeah.
Okay. No.
Estrobolome or estrobolome. Yeah. So it's the part of the microbiome that the genetics of the bacteria in our gut that are that metabolize estrogen. So yes, it definitely plays a role. It's particularly looked at in terms of other conditions too. I mean, possibly fibroids, but other things like endometriosis and adenomyosis, or conditions where estrogen is too high. Estrogen is sort of the main concern, and so yeah. I mean, I would I think, but at any stage in life, it's important to have that aspect of estrogen detoxification or metabolism dialed in. A healthy gut. The other thing that really impairs estrogen metabolism is alcohol. Big time, which is why probably one of the mechanisms why alcohol increases breast cancer risk. And I know I just want to touch on that. I mean, I know this narrative that estrogen doesn't play any role in breast cancer. That's not true. Like it's still. I mean, I agree. I think modern day hormone therapy is much safer than we thought. I think the biggest probably breast cancer risk from old school hormone therapy was the progestin, which really speaks a lot about the whole progestin versus progesterone side of things. But that's not to say that estrogen's completely off the hook. I mean, it does promote cellular division and growth. So back to the whole, yes, alcohol. We know alcohol promotes breast cancer. And I think one of the mechanisms is probably that it increases estrogen. The other thing I'm going to give a plug for in terms of estrogen detoxification and clearance, and also sheltering receptors from too much estrogen, is iodine. Yes. So I think you had another podcast about that recently. I do prescribe it quite a lot for my patients, sort of the higher dose molecular iodine, which can the breasts seem to love. So it can be a way to just eliminate breast pain, dramatically improve breast cysts. Yes, and also it tends to improve other conditions associated with high estrogen seem to improve with.
And how does it work in the body?
Yeah, well, it's doing, as far as my understanding is, it's doing probably via two main mechanisms. It's also, the two main mechanisms would be it downregulates estrogen receptors in the cells, so it helps to sort of calm them down, and also promotes healthy estrogen detoxification kind of through the liver. And also iodine is also immune regulating and antimicrobial, and has all sorts of other intriguing potential benefits potentially. But it's also one of those things where a little bit is good, but you don't want too much, because it is true that too much iodine can be harmful for the thyroid.
Is this perimenopause and postmenopause? And
I think, I mean, the women who are suffering from high estrogen symptoms and who would usually need iodine and that sort of dosing would be usually perimenopause. But I think, I mean, so I'll just speak for myself postmenopause. I'm on a little bit of estradiol. And so I do still take, like, not a high dose, but I still keep iodine in place just to kind of make sure I'm clearing estrogen properly and potentially helping shelter my breasts from it. Yeah.
right. Because as you say, because I am seeing on social media, doctors say, no, there's no increased risk of breast cancer from taking estradiol.
Yeah. So, I mean, so there's different questions there, right? Like, I guess, everyone's trying to look at the data as like, is there increased breast cancer risk from hormone therapy? Depending on which data set you're looking at and which progestin was involved. I think it's just to say again, I do think the old school progestin was highly implicated. Like it's a top suspect of what was going on there, which I'll just point out 30 years ago when I started practicing and all the naturopathic doctors were like, get everyone off the progestin and onto natural progesterone because it's way safer for the breasts. That was called that exactly. That was the word. It's like, what are you talking about? This progesteron's the same thing. It's no problem whatsoever. But yes, so
well, can we just go back to a minute to the invisible forces of industry? There is no other, it's just very hard to walk back from what the commonly held beliefs are. One, like, because you have to stick your neck out and possibly be called crazy, and medicine is a field like that. But behind that is like, this is what we sell. This is what is offered. And there's always going to be a push to promote that. So,
yeah. So the progestin versus progesterone is a big part of the story, actually. But in answer to your question, does properly dosed estrogen therapy balanced with a body identical progesterone increase breast cancer risk? I would say not very much. I think likely it's not very promoting, which is reassuring, right? Like, it's probably way safer than we thought. So that's probably the accurate message. I mean, that doesn't mean, I don't think, surely no one out there is saying ergo, therefore estrogen in general plays no role whatsoever in breast cancer. I mean, I don't think anyone could say that. I mean, I think I'm
seeing comments of some doctors where women will say, doesn't it cause breast cancer? And a doctor will say no. Just no.
Properly dosed therapy, it doesn't significantly increase the risk. But I mean, sure. But like, it's still biochemically, I mean, I think it's still a driver. And like having lifetime higher levels of estrogen is still a driver, and probably, I mean, I can get into hormonal birth control as well. Like, what about that synthetic estrogen they're giving everyone, and all the progestins, and I mean, all this debate. I mean, I know I started the podcast with this, but I just keep circling back, and I've been saying this for a number of years now. All this focus on what hormones are safe for menopausal women versus not safe, and the move, thank God, to body identical hormones are safer. And meanwhile, young women, I mean, just to say again, they have their own hormones, their own estradiol switched off. And in place of that is synthetic ethynyl estradiol, which is not as safe. I mean, arguably, potentially more breast cancer promoting than normal estradiol, and a progestin. Like, I just like, it just feels like this, like.
And if you question that, it's way too scary for people because they've been taking it for so long and believe so strongly in it. And we're told that it's safe. But if you have gone on it and then you go off of it and you have problems, I'm one of those women, you'll never know. You'll just never know what you would have been like without it. And if you would have struggled.
It is scary. I think you're right. I think a big part of the resistance is just like, oh my goodness, but it's so many women, like it's hundreds of millions.
Oh, if we start questioning that, like, listen, I've had a huge awakening in the last couple of years, and you don't want to start questioning stuff like this, because if you do, it just leads to the next thing and the next thing. And then you're the person that no one wants to talk to at a party.
Right. You're the guest at the dinner party.
Yeah. They're like, oh God, there's Ann Marie over there talking about what, so don't do it if you don't want to know. Just back to the metabolizing through the liver, we put the 3 pathways.
Yes.
And I feel like the pooping out the estrogen is like, you got to get the basics right. Like, you often see this on social media. Everyone worrying about these like high level things, but they don't have the basics or even understand it. So you need to have proper bowel movements.
Yeah, that's why I started with that. I mean, I think the recirculation in the bowel is probably the main takeaway, and the
And if
alcohol,
you're
the way
okay,
alcohol.
if
Yeah.
you're cutting your alcohol and you're having regular bowel movements, you probably don't
Yeah.
need to worry about niching down. But people like to do that, and there's a lot of worried well people, and there's all these tests out there that will tell you. So what's going on there with the pathways in the
Yeah,
liver?
so this is down the different estrone or estrone metabolites, and there's like there used to be just 4 and 16, and now there's like, I mean, to be honest, Anne Marie, it's been a while since I looked at those reports, so I'm a little bit worried about trying to explain it all
There's
and
a
getting it
number of
wrong. But
pathways.
yes,
I like to keep it simple. There's a number of
yep.
pathways, and certain tests will tell you what the pathways are going down. And I'm not going to get into them either.
I'm pretty sure it's 4 estrone. That is for whatever the number is. Like, so one of the
2,
estrogen
4, and
metabolites
16.
is, yeah.
When one of
So
them
I
is
think
not
it's pretty inflammatory and potentially
with
cancer
the
promoting,
4,
but not.
the
I think
4.
I'm pretty sure it's 4.
Okay.
I
Well,
really
I'll
hope I
fact
got
check.
that right. You
I'll
can fact check that before you publish. Um, and yeah, I mean, but just to say again, it's this would be cumulative over years, right? Like, so it's not like if you have, I mean, everyone's making some of that metabolite, I think, and it's not like if you've made it a few times, like that's, you know, it just means like over many, many years, if that's continually happening and also in combination with other things and your immune function and all, I mean, there's many, obviously everyone would agree. I think breast cancer is multifactorial for sure. So the reason I used to do that testing a lot more, because I guess, I mean, because you could potentially use different herbal medicines to try to promote estrogen to go down safer pathways. And I think that's somewhat valid. The reason I personally, as a clinician, stop using those testing is, as you say, it's just kind of high level complicated when for a lot of people, if you can just, yeah, get some of the other things dialed in properly, I think you're getting a lot more effect for less expense and less complication. But again, I'm not anti that testing. I think obviously some people are, yeah,
Yeah.
doing it a lot. So, yeah.
You mentioned alcohol, and we have touched on
Yeah.
this other times I've talked to you, but very few people are talking about alcohol and estradiol.
Yeah. So it does increase. So temporarily, like while the liver is, I guess in very simplistic terms, while the liver is metabolizing alcohol, it has to push the estrogen metabolism to the side. I mean, this might be a way to think about it. It's like it's only so much it can do at one time. So we do know, and I don't know to what extent, but I do know that serum level estrogen will increase after alcohol for a few hours, right? Just while the body's sort of dealing with other things. So that is, I believe, generally perceived to be one of the ways that alcohol increases the risk of breast cancer, but it's not the other way. It's not the only way. I mean, alcohol breaks down into aldehydes and there's other toxic direct effect, and alcohol causes intestinal permeability, and there's lots of other ways that it would potentially increase cancer risk. It's interesting that when I've looked at some people writing about the alcohol breast cancer risk, it is solid, right? Like it's not, there's so many things in science we're like, well, we're not sure. You know, one scientist says one thing, another scientist says another thing. All the scientists agree. Alcohol increases breast cancer risk slightly. It's linear. So the more you drink, the higher the risk. So, and it's going to depend always on other risk factors, but there's really no one debating, oh, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Like it does. It increases.
Yeah. So what if you're taking hormone therapy and estrogen containing hormone therapy and you're drinking regularly, as many people do every day?
Well, again, I guess you sort of have to, factor it all in. And does that, does the presence of alcohol then change the numbers on, as you know, that like the amount to which modern day hormone therapy, estrogen plus natural progesterone therapy increases breast cancer risk? I mean, I think it's just debatable. That is one of the statistics that's in flux right now. That's just, people are unsure. I think one of the reasons it's so much in flux is because we're now using different body identical hormone therapy that we weren't, 20 or 30 years ago. So that makes it really hard to crunch the numbers, I would think. I feel sorry for the scientists trying to do that, actually, because we're comparing apples with oranges. We're now looking at, again, I do think
International Menopause Society, they had a white paper on hormone therapy, and they said, we need this long-term randomized controlled trial to figure this out, but that's going to be so expensive, and it's probably not going to happen. So in the meantime, we just have to look for the best quality observational studies. And I thought that was really interesting, right? Because they're saying until we get this data, we can't say for sure, but we're not going to get the data in our time.
Yeah. And of course, observational studies have weaknesses, as you know.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, it's frustrating. And I know people want simple answers, but I think a takeaway would be modern day hormone therapy is a lot safer than we thought. So that's encouraging. That's good that's a good takeaway. I think most people would agree with that.
And another takeaway is something you said earlier was why not get some progesterone and see in the early stages of perimenopause or any stage and then see how you felt for a couple of days or a couple of weeks. And then
Exactly.
later
Just to
in
see.
some.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you're going to be on this for a long time, it's worth it to take those steps and that care for yourself.
Yeah. And so just to clarify, because I've had this conversation on social media a little bit. So just we'll get it the right way around. So it is possible to take progesterone without estrogen.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's in general not possible to do the other way around, right? Like so I get people saying, "Oh, but which way was it? I think you're not supposed to take progesterone with estrogen." Or no, it's so you can take progesterone alone.
Yes.
If you have a uterus, you shouldn't take estrogen alone long term. That's the
right.
direction
So
it goes.
you're never taking estrogen alone without progesterone. So you're never getting a chance to see if maybe you only needed progesterone.
Yeah. And another way to kind of promote the possibility of progesterone only, if this helps people get their head around it, obviously progestins only are prescribed all the time. So for women with heavy periods, they'll be like, take this progestin, take Primulute or Provera or something like that, or the hormonal IUD, which is levonorgestrel, like take a progestin to lighten flow. So that's obviously a normal thing to do. So sometimes I'm like, well, just present it as I'm going to take progesterone to lighten flow, which it can do, as we know from the research from Geraldine Pryor and her protocols. And then, like, if you can even say, I want to take it, I want to try it to lighten flow, and then actually see if it actually helps with sleep and anxiety and heart palpitations and and migraines and all the other things, just as a side benefit. The doctor doesn't have to be convinced that it's going to do any of those things, but most doctors are pretty happy to prescribe progesterone for heavy flow because that's one of its indications. Yeah.
And you can also go to the doctor and get the full prescription, and you can do that, right? Like, because I know it's hard to get into a doctor and go back. And so you can just go get the whole shebang and just like do your own, but progesterone alone. You can't do it with estrogen.
Yeah. It's funny because I do say that in my book, so I'm willing to say it again here. I mean, you could accept both and just start with only the progesterone. But that came up on social media a couple months ago, and then people got mad at me because then you're kind of like, yes, in theory, like you're stockpiling estrogen patches, the precious estrogen patches that other people can't get, and you've got them and you're not even using them.
Oh my God. I mean, what is it? How many is it? Like the things people get freaked out about. Okay. So I at the start, before we started recording, you told me about your orcas and what you started thinking about orcas. So tell me.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm an evolutionary biologist. That was my work before I became a naturopathic doctor. And once an evolutionary biologist, always an evolutionary biologist. You can never unsee it, the world, through that lens. That's the lens I see everything. In Hormone Repair Manual, my perimenopause book, I do talk about, it's pretty clear from the research that humans evolved to go through menopause, or more specifically, that humans evolved a longer human lifespan so that women specifically could spend 3 or 4 decades after reproduction ended. And it's quite astonishing. And there's a book called The Slow Moon Climbs that builds that case, which people, if they want a deep dive into all the evidence suggesting that, they can look at that. The only other species that have done that, have this extra long post-reproductive lifespan, are a couple species of whale, including orcas. So I was just lying there this morning, actually popped awake it wasn't that early, 7 o'clock, thinking, the first thing that came into my mind is like, because I knew I was going to be talking to you today, I thought, seriously, like, have any biologists looked at whether these matriarch orcas, these like amazing matriarchs who are like helping with the survival of their entire family group, including all the adult males, they're helping them live longer and not fight and find food. And has anyone sort of tested whether they are suffering from estrogen deficiency? I mean, we know their estrogen will be low because orcas have an estrous cycle. So during their reproductive years, they are ovulating every 45 days or so, if there's enough food to eat. And so their estradiol's going up and down every, not quite month, but similar to us. And then when they stop ovulating, they're going to stop making that amount of ovarian estradiol. So they're technically in an estrogen deficient state too, but they actually seem fine. So I don't know if any biologists I couldn't locate any research that had been done, whether they're, suffering from that or whether they're fine. I mean, they live to about 80, sort of similar to us.
Right.
So,
and we're hearing every day, if you turn on Instagram, you're hearing that it is a deficient next to disease state, but no one's thinking about the whales. How are they doing it? And imagine the patch we'd have to put on all of them if this spreads. And
just imagining an estradiol patch for a whale, that would be like, I imagine like the Greenpeace campaigners, like those poor menopausal whales, like, oh my goodness, they have no estradiol. The whales would have to take a break from, you know how the orcas are like ramming like little yachts in the Mediterranean or something. They don't know what they're doing. Like they're sinking, like sort of they're sinking, but they're damaging these boats in the Mediterranean. And they seem to be teaching each other to do this. Actually, to be fair, it's a lot of teenagers whales that are doing it. So I doubt the matriarchs are doing that, but like she'd have to take a break from her other duties to like, okay, we're going to like put some estrogen on you.
Estrogen, maybe. And then some people might say that that's because she's angry and things aren't going well. She doesn't have her premenopausal levels of estrogen.
Right. If it was the matriarchs banging up the ships or little yachts, then that would be why. But
do you think it's the youngers? Do you think it's the boys?
They think actually it's the teenagers, but I don't. I'd have to check the latest data on that. But it's intriguing. It's like, what are they? It's scary for the humans that are on these boats. Like it's it's quite frightening.
Maybe they've just had enough, of us.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe.
They've just had it, and they've decided to fight back. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's not an informed opinion.
No, exactly. But I'm going to leave my takeaway from the conversation is just imagining what an estrogen patch for an orca would look like. Yeah. You're right. It would have to be quite big, and I don't know what their skin is like. How that would. Yeah.
Getting the plastic off, and then getting cold still. Yeah. Well, I mean, if what everyone is saying is true, then we should start to worry about the orcas and their estradiol levels. So.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. That was great.
It's great.
Estrogen now. That's what I'm going to call it. Estrogen now.
Hotflash Inc. was created and is hosted by Ann Marie McQueen, produced and edited by Sonia Mack. The information contained in this podcast is intended for informational purposes only and is not intended for the purpose of diagnosing, treating, curing, or preventing any disease. Before using any products referenced on the podcast, consult with your healthcare provider, read all labels, and heed all directions and cautions that accompany the products. Information received through the podcast should not be used in place of a consultation or advice from a healthcare provider. If you suspect you have a medical problem, i.e. menopause or anything else, or any healthcare questions, please promptly see your healthcare provider. This podcast, including Ann Marie McQueen and any producers or editors, disclaim any responsibility from any possible adverse effects from the use of any information contained herein. Opinions of guests on this podcast are their own, and the podcast does not endorse or accept responsibility for statements made by guests. This podcast does not make any representations or warranties about a guest's qualifications or credibility. This podcast may contain paid endorsements and advertisements for products or services. Individuals on this podcast may have direct or indirect financial interest in products or services referred to herein. This podcast is owned by Hotflash Inc. Media.